Bloomberg Audio Studios.
Podcasts, radio, news.
Russia wants to show there is an alternative to a world run on the West's terms.
The BRICS states stand united in their support for intensifying cooperation in the global arena based on the key principles of the UN Charter and jointly strive to contribute in every possible way to the formation of a fair multipolar world order with the decisive participation of the countries of the global South and East in the systems of international governance.
The BRICS summit in Kazan is Putin's attempt to show that Russia is not alone. The Kremlin billed it as one of the largest-scale foreign policy events ever, and African countries are playing a key role.
BRICS is an inclusive formation that has the ability to change the trajectory of the global South. To do this, we must realize the full potential of our economic partnership to ensure sustainable development for all and not just for some.
On this week's Next Africa podcast, we'll ask what Russia needs from Africa and what the region wants in return. Is Russia an important ally or simply a way to show the rest of the world that the West isn't the only game in town? I'm Jennifer Zabasajja, and this is the Next Africa podcast, bringing you one story each week from the continent, driving the future of global growth with the context only Bloomberg can provide. Joining me to discuss Russia's relationship with Africa this week are Bloomberg senior reporter Henry Meyer and S'thembile Cele, Bloomberg's government and eco reporter based here in Johannesburg. Hello to both of you. Thanks for joining us on the podcast. Henry, let's just start with you. Maybe give us some background on BRICS and what exactly was on the agenda for the summit this week.
So this is an organization which was founded about 15 years ago by Russia, China, India, and Brazil. And then it took in South Africa in 2010 and became BRICS. It's essentially an organization which includes developing countries and seen by some of its members, particularly Russia and China, as an alternative to the US-led world order. This is not a view which is widely shared by the other members. And this meeting that took place in Russia is the first time that the organization has met since it expanded to take in 4 new members. Those members are Ethiopia and Egypt, 2 new African countries, and Iran and the United Arab Emirates. In terms of what was on the agenda, obviously a part of their agenda is trying to increase the role of developing countries, particularly in the world's international financial architecture, develop economic ties between themselves and reduce the use of the US dollar. And also they were looking at the issue of whether they are ready to expand further.
It's telling too, Henry, I mean, the location of this, the backdrop of what's happening geopolitically. When you think about a lot of those agenda items, what, if anything, do we know, did they achieve at this summit?
Well, the mere fact of the summit taking place at all is certainly by Russia seen as a major achievement. As you mentioned, the geopolitical scenario, Russia is obviously under unprecedented sanctions and the West is trying to isolate it over its invasion of Ukraine. In total, more than 30 leaders attended this meeting. This includes countries which want to join, as well as the 9 members. We don't have so far any tangible results from the summit. We do believe, however, that approximately 12 countries will be invited to become observer members. So not full membership, but maybe a sort of halfway house.
And what's interesting too, Henry, about this, we have a few Bloomberg economics intelligence reports about how the expanding bloc doesn't necessarily mean that all of these different countries are going to be having the same relationship, right? The same bilateral relationship. But if we just take one of those, China's relationship with South Africa, with Africa, we know a lot of that has come with checkbooks, has been about infrastructure. But when we think about Russia as the host of this year's summit, what do we know about Russia's relations with some of the other countries that are in the BRICS membership?
If we talk specifically about Africa, then obviously China's approach, as you mentioned, is quite different. It's much more based on financial and economic ties. Obviously, the level of trade is very interesting. The Russian trade with Africa is very small. It's only $25 billion a year versus more than $280 billion for China. And the Russian approach, I would characterize it as developing ties with Africa on the cheap, if you like. A lot of it is to do with diplomatic benefits for African countries and also security ties, and particularly with countries where military rulers have taken over. This is the case in the Sahel, in Western Africa. And this is, I think, the approach that Russia has yielded real benefits for them. At the UN, there have been African countries which have not backed votes condemning Russia for its invasion of Ukraine. And it's allowed Russia also to counter the isolation that the West has been trying to impose on it.
And one of those countries that have taken a bit of a neutral stance is South Africa. S'thembile, if you can join in on this. Obviously, a key part of the BRICS, was the host last year for the summit. How would you characterize South Africa's relationship with Russia right now?
I think it is, from a foreign policy perspective, one which in the first instance is historical, and that certainly came into play with last year's BRICS summit and the negotiations around having the president of Russia not come, lest he be arrested on that warrant of arrest from the International Criminal Court. But in terms of trade, it is actually very limited, trade that happens between the two countries, so not significant in that sense. I think the approach to Russia is similar to the approach of countries in general for South Africa, which is we are dealing from the aspect of national interest. What can we get out of this now? And South Africa has pushed really hard to be seen as being part of the revival of the so-called non-aligned movement, where there is not neutrality, but a position which says we're not going to get involved in every spat that you're involved with. Our allegiance, it should not be tested in that way. We should not be seen as taking this side or that side. We should be doing what we believe to be right, what is compliant with the international rule of law, and what is in our national interest economically and otherwise. And so I think that's South Africa's position. Even if you look at the inputs that President Ramaphosa has been making, he's been pushing the idea of this is where we're at now in terms of this coalition government that we've got going. And this is what we want to see in terms of the international order. And that is very much a reform of multilateral institutions. They need to be fair. There needs to be a representation of the global South at these forums, and they need to be heard in terms of what the interests are and what the priorities are of countries in that region. I think that's the main push really to say that's how we are engaging as South Africa. What is in it for us, and what is the structure of the international order? Is it fair?
And non-aligned was the right word. Thank you for using that, S'thembile. On the agenda this week, there were plans to try to expand the BRICS group. We mentioned how last year that was a part of the summit, but South Africa has been pretty vocal in their own stance in terms of expanding it out. All the BRICS countries really have been. S'thembile, what is the resistance to adding some of the countries that have been floated into the BRICS bloc from South Africa?
So I think there's definitely a division within BRICS on a number of levels. It's not as clear-cut as what the president of Russia would have you believe. This is not a huge moment where everyone is at the table and they're all, saying kumbaya and agreeing with each other. There are some very real differences. I mean, if you're looking at some of the divisions, it might be if you look at the founding members, Brazil, India, and South Africa, they have a very different worldview in general to Russia and China in terms of some of the approaches that they have to matters. And so they, for instance, are democratic countries. They are not interested in BRICS being a counter to the West. They are interested simply in increasing representation in the international order. And so I think that's where there is a difference. Russia and China might want to be using the BRICS bloc to further their own interests, to further their own placement in the world, to say, you know what, we have friends, we have allies. And these three countries in particular are saying, no, this is more complicated than that. We need to take a step back and see what is it that we are actually wanting to achieve.
Stick with us, Henry and S'thembile. When we come back, we'll look at what impact Russia has already had on the continent and what African leaders potentially want to get out of this relationship. Welcome back. Today on the podcast, we're discussing Russia's relationship with Africa, that as the BRICS summit ends in Kazan. Henry, talk to us maybe about where Russia has had the most influence in Africa. S'thembile really laid out there a lot of the differing relationships that the members of the bloc have had, but maybe talk to us from the perspective of the Russian state.
Yes, the major Russian influence is in West Africa, in Sahel region, where you have a big problem with jihadist violence. And this has given Russia an opening to start providing security services. This began in 2018 in the Central African Republic when Russian mercenaries arrived at the invitation of the president. 3 years later, they started to work in Mali, and this has now accelerated. This year, in both Burkina Faso and Niger, you have a Russian military presence. In addition to those countries, I would also mention a couple of other countries where Russia does have a strong presence. Libya, also a military presence in the east of the country, where Russia is allied to the eastern-based strongman Khalifa Haftar. Sudan, Russia is supporting paramilitary forces which are fighting the military rulers in Khartoum. And then you have other countries like Zimbabwe and, of course, South Africa, where you have these historic links because of Soviet support for liberation movements.
We're clearly seeing this sort of tug of war for influence and for partnership to a certain extent on the continent. I mean, S'thembile, can you talk to us about maybe the perspective of African leaders? And I know you can't speak for all of them, but what is the benefit for them to be, you mentioned non-alignment, to look to countries like Russia, like China? Is it just wanting to send that message that they are open to any and all partners? Or have we heard from them that there's something else at play here?
Yeah, so definitely don't speak for all of them. Thank you for that. But so Bloomberg Economy News had a really interesting piece about this concept of geopolitical neutrality, how not picking sides is paying off for certain countries. And so previously, it would be so easy to say this country is aligned with this side of the world, and so this is how they're going to determine things going forward. I think with Russia's invasion of Ukraine, that was a significant shift. Even if you look at the UN votes, and how African countries voted in a way that was unexpected, against it, for it, or a large number of them choosing to abstain altogether. And I think that was the first significant shift to say there is a different occurrence that's happening, and we can't really interpret or read things through the same lens that we had historically. Countries are asserting themselves. They have a level of agency that they are trying to put out there into the world. And so that happens in different ways. Coming on board or allowing the likes of China and Russia to come on board. There's the security issues that Henry has spoken through, but there's also economic issues, right? And to South Africa and those that are supporting it in their bid for reform of international institutions, one of the issue, right, is access to funding and how the developing countries are being left out, or the bar is so high for them to get access to the funding that they need to develop. And so when someone like a Russia or a China comes in, of course, we can discuss the merits of the conditions of that funding. But if I need to grow my economy today and someone is offering something, I'm going to go for it. I'm going to do what is in my national interests at this particular point. And so I think there's a lot of dynamics at play. There's a growing autonomy in the region to say, how can we do things differently? How can we do things on our term? And obviously, there's a whole lot of other stuff at play in the background. These countries are not benevolent factors. They're not doing this out of the goodness of their hearts. They have their own interests at play as well. But what Russia and China would like to do with the BRICS bloc, that is an example of that, right? So they're coming to Africa, and it's not just them. There's Gulf countries as well. They have ulterior motives. And I think African countries and leaders are trying to figure out, well, what can we get out of this? You want this from me. This is what I want to achieve. What is the middle ground, and how do we go about doing that? So I think things are becoming more complicated. The proxy wars that we've seen are shifted. Power has shifted in terms of the global order, and everyone is just facing time to establish their place in this and how to get the most out for themselves going forward.
Absolutely. A new multipolar world. And I wonder, Henry, what is next to pay attention to with this bloc and with these multiple forces and this new world order? What would you say is sort of key to watch?
Well, I think as far as BRICS is concerned, it's the degree to which they're going to manage to cooperate economically and increase trade. A lot of the trade within BRICS is between China and the other countries. The other intra-BRICS trade isn't that significant. The other issue is, of course, the use of the US dollar. And this is something that Russia, because of the sanctions that have been imposed on it over its invasion of Ukraine, is especially keen to promote. There is obviously interest in that among BRICS countries, but they have a different perspective. I think they're looking for an alternative to their ties with the West, but they're not looking to replace them fully, whereas Russia is completely frozen out of ties with the West. So I think we will see that trend develop, but certainly not as fast or as deeply as Russia would like to see.
And you can read more on our coverage of the BRICS summit across Bloomberg News platforms. Here's a few other stories we're watching in the region this week. Nigerian President Bola Tinubu announced an overhaul of his cabinet, firing 5 ministers in the first such shakeup since he took office in May of 2023. Tinubu dropped the Minister of Women Affairs, Tourism, Education, Housing, and Urban Development, as well as the Minister of Youth Development. And South Africa plans to ease visa rules for visitors from India and China within days to lure tourists from the world's 2 most populated nations who have been deterred by red tape. Unlike travelers from many Western nations, Indian and Chinese tourists need pre-authorization, which could put off visitors. And you can follow these stories across Bloomberg platforms, including the Next Africa newsletter. We'll put a link to that in the show notes. This program was produced by Adrian Bradley. Don't forget to follow and review this show wherever you usually get your podcasts. I'm Jennifer Zabasajja. Thanks as always for listening.